My name is Elias. At least, I'm fairly certain it is. The name feels right, fits like an old coat, but in these times, you can't trust feelings. Feelings are the first things to go. I'm a historian, or I was, before the world decided history wasn't worth remembering anymore. Now I'm more of a dragon guarding a hoard of treasure nobody wants. The treasure is the Grand Archive, this massive, sealed library in what used to be Boston. It's a mausoleum of human thought, packed floor to ceiling with books, journals, and records. The collected memory of a species that's actively forgetting itself. We're 5 years into the outbreak of what the news initially called Leith's Kiss, a fittingly poetic name for something so brutal. It's an airborne virus, a phantom that slips into your lungs and goes straight for your soul. It doesn't kill you, not in the traditional sense, it just prunes you. It starts with the memories that have the most emotional weight. Your first love, the pride you felt at graduation, the face of your child. It snips them away, one by one, until all that's left is a placid, hollow shell of a person. We call them the forgotten. My own personal ghost, the one that chased me into this dusty sanctuary, isn't the virus itself, but the fear that powers it. I was a professor at the university. During a major public symposium, a televised event, I was challenged on a key date from the Franco-Prussian War. I knew it. I had taught it 100 times. But in that moment, under the hot lights with 1,000 eyes on me, my mind was a perfect, silent blank. The silence stretched. The sweat on my brow felt like ice. The feeling of absolute naked incompetence was the most profound terror I'd ever experienced. My career never recovered from that single public moment of forgetting. So when the world started forgetting, I ran in the opposite direction. I locked myself in here, surrounded by facts, dates, and hard data, things without emotional charge. I figured the virus couldn't touch me here. The archive isn't just a library. It's my fortress against the encroaching void. My desperate attempt to prove that a mind filled with knowledge is a mind that can't be broken. The forgotten are the physical proof of my failure, the walking embodiment of my deepest fear. I see them sometimes from the reinforced windows on the top floor, shuffling through the skeletal remains of the city. They don't shamble like the zombies from old movies. Their movements are fluid, aimless. They'll walk until they meet a wall, then turn and walk the other way. The truly chilling part is their faces. They all have this serene, gentle smile. It's the smile of someone without a single worry, a single pain, a single memory to haunt them. They are the terrifying peace that awaits us all. The virus that made them, tabula rasa, was a government creation, a bioweapon designed to pacify dissent by erasing the memories that fuel it. An elegant, horrific solution. And now, its unchecked programming just keeps running, pruning humanity down to nothing. The real horror isn't their presence, it's the gnawing understanding that their placid emptiness is contagious. That one day, I might look in a mirror and see that same vacant smile staring back. The silence in the archive is usually my comfort, a thick, heavy blanket woven from paper and dust. But for the last week, a new sound has joined it, a cough. Not from a person, but from the building itself. The rhythmic, stuttering wheeze of the main air filtration system. It's the building's heart, and it's failing. Every strained gasp sends a tremor of cold dread through me. For 5 years, these filters have been the only thing keeping Leith's Kiss out. The air outside is thick with it, an invisible poison that I can almost feel pressing against the windows, waiting patiently to seep in. My sanctuary is about to become my tomb. I spent days with the schematics spread out on a massive oak table, my hands covered in grease and my mind racing. The diagnosis was grim. A complete failure of the primary CO2 scrubber unit. It's an archaic, specialized piece of tech, irreplaceable. The thought made my stomach clench. Without it, the air inside will become toxic within a month. I'd either suffocate on my own breath or be forced to open the doors and welcome the fog of forgetfulness. There was only one place to find a part that specific, a name that tasted like rust and fear in my mouth: OmniGen Labs. It was a black site on the other side of the city, the very place that had birthed Tabula Rasa. Going there was a suicide mission. But there was another, more desperate reason pulling me there. OmniGen didn't just create the plague. Rumor has it they were working on a cure. A desperate, insane hope began to bloom in the barren soil of my fear. The mission became twofold: a supply run for a simple machine part, and a crusade for the salvation of the human mind. To save my body and my archive of facts, I had to risk my own soul in the one place where memories went to die. My journey to the lab felt like a descent into someone else's nightmare. I moved through the skeletal city, my footsteps echoing in the unnatural quiet. My focus was narrowed to a single point: the schematics of the lab I'd memorized. Logic, facts, that was the armor for my mind. I told myself that Letha's kiss preyed on emotion, and I was a man of pure intellect. It was a lie, and I knew it, but it was the only prayer I had. The first real scare didn't come from a shambling crowd or a sudden noise. It was quiet, personal, and it cut right through the flimsy armor of my logic. I had ducked inside a derelict city bus to let a small cluster of the forgotten drift by, the hiss of my suit's rebreather sounding deafeningly loud in the confined space. And then I saw him. He was sitting by the window, a man in a worn tweed jacket, not unlike my own. In his lap was a swollen, pulpy brick of moldy paper that was once a book. His fingers, skeletal and pale, were tracing patterns across the mush, his brow furrowed in concentration, as if he were actually reading the ghost of the words. He looked up, not at me, but through me, and the placid smile I had only ever seen from a distance spread across his face. And then it happened. The world shimmered, the edges of the bus dissolving into a strange heat-haze distortion. I saw it, a memory ghost. It wasn't just a flicker. The man was suddenly younger, his face full of life, and he was laughing, a silent, joyous laugh that shook his whole body. A woman with hair the color of fire was leaning her head on his shoulder, her own smile radiant. The book in his lap was crisp and new. I could see the sunlight streaming through the bus window, glinting off a wedding band on his finger. It was so real, so vibrant, I felt like an intruder. Then, just as quickly, the color bled away. The woman dissolved into nothingness. The man's face slackened, the laughter lines vanishing, leaving only the serene, empty mask. The sunlight died, replaced by the oppressive gray gloom. The book rotted in his hands. He was alone again. My own breath caught in my throat, a ragged, painful gasp. The chill that went through me wasn't fear of an attack. It was the absolute, soul-crushing horror of recognition. In his empty gaze, I saw the peaceful, mindless end that was promised to me, and my carefully constructed walls of intellect crumbled into dust. I stumbled out of the bus and pressed on. The ghost of that man's smile burned into my retinas. The experience had shaken me to my core. I kept checking the diagnostic panel on my wrist, looking for an explanation. a glitch in the helmet's visor, a spike in atmospheric toxins causing a mild hallucination? My mind, the logical, academic mind I had cultivated as my ultimate defense, was scrambling for a rational foothold. Denial was a powerful drug, and I took a heavy dose. It was stress. It was the recycled air. It was anything but what it felt like. A glimpse into the mechanics of the plague itself. A vision of a memory being hollowed out. I forced myself to focus on the mission, on the schematics of Omnigen, on the precise torque needed for the scrubber's mounting bolts. Facts. Data. The building loomed ahead, a black glass monolith that seemed to absorb the light around it. The lobby was a cathedral of corporate hubris, all sterile white walls and shattered glass. Emergency lights cast long, dancing shadows that seemed to writhe with a life of their own. I moved through the abandoned offices, the silence broken only by the crunch of glass under my boots and the frantic pounding of my own heart. It was a museum of interrupted lives. Desks were still littered with personal effects, a child's drawing of a lopsided sun taped to a monitor, a cold cup of coffee with a perfect lipstick stain on the rim, a pair of overturned high heels next to a desk, as if their owner had simply vanished mid-stride. I found a researcher's terminal that was still drawing power from a backup grid. On it, a final unsent email. It spoke of tabula rasa, of its horrifying efficacy, and it mentioned the cure, Project Mnemosyne, locked away on the central server, protected by a decryption key so complex it was tied to the lead researcher's own biometric and mnemonic data. The email confirmed it. The cure was real. My insane hope hadn't been a fantasy. Finding that email was the point of no return. Before, I could have grabbed the scrubber from the environmental control room and run. Now, I couldn't. Leaving that data here would be a betrayal of every book in my archive, of every life story I had sworn to protect. The weight of that public failure from years ago settled on me again, but this time it was different. It wasn't a source of shame, it was fuel. I would not fail this time. I found the main server room behind a heavy, reinforced steel door. The console next to it glowed a soft green. My gloved finger hovered over the screen. This was it. The moment I committed, there was no turning back. I pressed the access panel. A soft female automated voice echoed through the halls, startlingly clear. Security protocol engaged. Server hub access has initiated facility-wide integrity check. Decontamination cycle will commence in 60 minutes. My blood ran cold. A series of heavy metal shutters slammed down over the windows and doors with a deafening final clang, plunging the corridor into a blood-red twilight. I was trapped. It was what happened next that froze my heart. The sound. A soft, collective sigh from the city outside, a sound I hadn't noticed until the alarm started. The noise, the flashing lights, it was a dinner bell. They were drawn to it. Through the thick, reinforced glass of the corridor shutters, I saw them. First one, then three, then a dozen. The forgotten emerging from the urban decay like moths to a dying flame. They weren't fast, but their sheer numbers were overwhelming. They gathered outside the main entrance, their placid faces tilted up towards the flashing lights, their bodies pressing against the glass. This was no longer an indirect threat. This was a siege. I could see them clearly now in the hellish red glow. An old woman whose hands were clasped peacefully as if in prayer, her eyes wide and serene. A young man in a courier's uniform, his empty bag slung over his shoulder, a faint, pleasant smile on his face. A little girl, no younger than 7, holding the hand of a woman who was probably her mother, both of them staring with the same placid curiosity. Each one was a portrait of forgotten tragedy.
Their eyes, all of them, were fixed on the building, on me. They weren't aggressive, they just watched, waiting. Their collective patience was more terrifying than any snarl.
Inside the server room, the roar of the cooling fans was a physical force, a hurricane of sound that did nothing to drown out the blaring alarms. The world outside the room's panoramic glass wall was a silent, horrifying ballet. The crowd of forgotten had swelled, their faces and hands pressed against the reinforced panes, their expressions unchanged, their eyes reflecting the frantic red strobes. They were a passive, suffocating wall of humanity. The cure, Project Mnemonicene, was right there, a single encrypted file on the main terminal. But the decryption key? The researcher's email hadn't lied. To get the cure, I had to willingly infect myself with a controlled dose of the virus's core programming. I had to perform a horrifying sacrifice, a targeted mental self-mutilation. I had to let it all go. The system prompted me, its text cold and clinical. Initiate mnemonic defragmentation. Select primary emotional anchor for discard. My wife's name, Sarah, was the first thing to flicker in my mind's eye. I saw her face, laughing in the kitchen, the sunlight catching the flower on her cheek. I felt the warmth of her hand in mine. With a shaking finger, I typed her name. For a moment, nothing happened. Then a wave of vertigo washed over me, so intense I had to grip the console to stay upright. It was like a physical blow. The image of her face didn't fade. It was violently ripped away, leaving a jagged, bleeding hole in my mind. The name Sarah was now just a collection of letters, holding no warmth, no love, no image of her face. A core piece of my soul had been scooped out, leaving a cold, clean space for the data to flow in. With a horrifying clarity, I understood what I had to do. The decryption key was a fortress, and my memories were the walls. I had to tear them down myself. Select next anchor. I closed my eyes and reached for my childhood home. Suddenly, I wasn't in the server room. I was 6 years old, the worn wooden floorboards of our little house cool under my bare feet. I could smell my mother's baking, a specific scent of cinnamon and burnt sugar. I could feel the exact weight of our cat sleeping on my chest. I typed home. The world dissolved into a screech of digital static. The smells, the feelings, the warmth, gone. Replaced by a new line of code, a new piece of the key, slotting into its place. The terror was unlike anything I could have imagined. It was the feeling of being unwritten, of my own history being erased by my own hand. Select next anchor. My wedding day. I saw Sarah. The name was still just letters, but the image was there, for a moment, walking toward me. I felt the warmth of my suit, tasted the cheap champagne, heard the sound of her laughter, a sound that had been my favorite music. I typed vows, sheared away, replaced by cold, elegant algorithms. I could feel my identity, my very being, fraying at the edges. I was becoming a machine of pure logic, my entire life the price for this single transaction. I glanced at the upload bar on the monitor. 98%, 99%. Just as it hit 100%, I caught my reflection in the dark screen. The face staring back was a stranger's, its features twisted in a mask of primal terror. But the horror in his eyes felt distant, a faint echo from a person I used to be. The man in the reflection was screaming, but I couldn't feel it myself. The door to the server room hissed open, the 60-minute cycle complete. My escape was clear. A flicker of the old me,
The historian who valued survival screamed at me to run. I turned, stumbling towards the open door, a desperate animal instinct for self-preservation taking over. I burst into the red-lit corridor, but my legs felt clumsy, disconnected. I couldn't remember the way out. The labyrinthine hallways I had navigated with such precision just an hour ago were now an impossible repeating maze. My short-term memory was gone. I ran into a wall, the impact jarring but strangely painless. I turned and ran into another. The escape I had earned was a prize I no longer had the mental capacity to claim. My flight devolved into a confused, shuffling walk, until I found myself back at the corridor with the glass shutters, facing the patient, silent crowd outside. The desire to escape had been one of the last things to go, and now it was gone too.
I walked out of the OmniGen building, not with the triumph of a savior, but with the profound and unnerving calm of the forgotten. The blaring alarms were just noise, the flashing red lights just colors. The crowd parted for me, their vacant eyes not even registering my presence as I joined them. I felt no fear, no anxiety, only a quiet sense of purpose fulfilled. My mission was complete. The heavy environment suit felt strangely light. I saw the bus where I had hidden earlier and felt nothing. I looked at my own hands, turning them over, and felt no connection to them. They were simply tools that had completed a task. My mind, once a fortress of facts and dates, was now a serene, open field, wiped clean of all the messy, painful, beautiful things that had once grown there. The pathological fear of forgetting, the trauma that had defined my entire existence, was gone. And in its absence, there was not relief, but a terrifying absolute peace. The irony was a concept I could no longer grasp. I had become the thing I feared most, a man without a past, a walking ghost with a placid smile. And I lacked the capacity to even know it. My shuffling feet fell into the same aimless rhythm as the others around me. One more ghost in the silent, smiling machine. Miles away, in a sterile underground bunker, a single green light blinked on a console. A data package had arrived. Dr. Eris Thorne, a man whose weary eyes had seen the end of the world, watched the download complete. There were two files, cure_tabula_rasa.pk and archivist_log evans.dat. He opened the log first, a morbid curiosity he couldn't suppress. It began with the clear academic writing of a historian, detailing a failing air system and a desperate plan. As he scrolled, the language grew more personal, the fear palpable between the lines of technical jargon. Then, near the end, the carefully constructed sentences began to fracture. The calm academic font devolved into a messy, capitalized scrawl, words repeated over and over. The last entry was a chilling testament to a mind coming apart, a frantic, looping script that ended mid-sentence. I must remember my name. I must remember the archive. The fear is the anchor, but I have to let it go. To save them, I have to forget her. I have to remember Sarah. I must remember my name. My name is... Eris felt a cold knot tighten in his stomach. He opened the other file. The cure was real. It was a complete reversal agent, a way to restore the pruned connections in the human mind. Humanity had a future. But as the program initialized, its code a beautiful, complex cascade of light on the screen, Eris could only stare at the last unfinished sentence from the man who had paid for it. A man whose name was now just another piece of forgotten history.
My name's Miles Corbin, and for 35 years, I've been a detective. You spend that long wading through the muck of other people's lives, you learn to develop a thick skin. It's a requirement of the job, like the cheap coffee and the perpetual exhaustion. You see the worst of humanity, the things people are capable of doing to each other for reasons as simple as greed or as complicated as love. And you learn to put it all into neat little boxes. Motive, means, opportunity. It's all just ugly arithmetic. You solve the equation, you file the report, and you move on to the next one. You have to. If you let even one of them really get under your skin, it'll burrow in like a tick and drain you dry. So you build a wall, brick by brick, with skepticism and cold logic. You tell yourself that there's an explanation for everything. That for every monster, there's a rational human reason for their monstrosity. You have to believe that, because the alternative is just too dark to consider. But my wall, the one I spent a lifetime building, has a crack in it. One case that defied math, one equation I could never solve, one ghost that doesn't rattle chains or whisper in the dark, but just sits there in the quiet moments, reminding me that all the logic in the world can't save a child. Her name was Lily, 10 years ago. A 7-year-old girl with bright red ribbons in her hair who vanished from her own backyard on a sunny afternoon. I've never forgotten the silence of that yard when we first arrived. The swing set swaying gently in a breeze that carried no laughter, the half-eaten apple left on the picnic blanket. We turned that town inside out. We interviewed every neighbor, every friend, every distant relative. We chased down every lead, no matter how thin, from the plausible to the outright bizarre. I personally walked every centimeter of the woods that border her house, my boots sinking into the damp earth, calling her name until my voice was raw. But it was like she'd been erased from the world. For weeks I sat with her parents in their suffocatingly quiet living room, watching the hope in their eyes curdle into a kind of permanent, hollow grief. I watched them become ghosts in their own home, surrounded by the bright, colorful artifacts of a life that had been stolen from them. They looked at me with a desperate faith that I, the seasoned detective, the man with the badge and the answers, could fix the unfixable. And I failed them, utterly. The case went cold, buried under the weight of the 1,000 other tragedies. But it never got buried for me. It became the defining failure of my life, the bedrock of my disillusionment. It's the reason I started taking the other cases, the ones the rest of the department laughed at, the supernatural files. Not because I suddenly started believing in ghouls and goblins, but because logic had failed me so profoundly with Lily, I couldn't afford to dismiss anything ever again. It was my penance, my quiet, desperate attempt to make sense of the one time nothing made sense at all. This brings me to the doll. I've never actually seen it, not with my own 2 eyes, but it lives in my head. It's the face I give my failure. In my mind, it's a porcelain doll, the kind you'd see in an antique shop, propped up on a dusty shelf. Its face is a spider web of fine cracks, the paint chipped away to show the grayish material underneath. One of its glass eyes is missing, leaving a dark, hollow socket that seems to suck in the light around it. The other stares blankly. Its painted-on cheerfulness, a grotesque parody of innocence. Its dress, once a sunny yellow, is tattered and stained with what my mind always supplies as a mixture of mud and grave dirt. It's a perfect symbol, isn't it? A doll is meant to be a child's companion, a silent keeper of secrets, a protector. But this one is broken, corrupted. It's a monument to a stolen childhood. It represents everything I was supposed to defend and everything I lost. The terror it holds for me isn't about a ghost in a toy. It's about the chilling, silent accusation that I stood by and let the darkness win. For 10 years, it's been a phantom, a nightmare I could mostly keep locked away. But lately, I've been getting the feeling that it's tired of living in my head. It wants to come out and play.
The first time it happened,
was on a Tuesday night. Rain was lashing against the windows of the precinct, the kind of miserable, persistent downpour that soaks deep into the city's bones. The office was empty, save for me and the low hum of the servers in the next room. I was neck deep in a new case, a 16-year-old runaway from a foster home. The details were just similar enough to Lily's file to be churning up old sludge in the back of my mind, and I was running on stale coffee and frustration. The air was thick with the smell of wet coats and old paper. I was staring at a photograph of the missing girl, trying to see something, anything, that the other detectives had missed, when I heard it, a faint scraping sound from the main hallway that ran the length of our floor. I paused, listening. It was probably just the ancient building settling, or maybe the janitor, but I knew he had already done his rounds. I dismissed it, turning my attention back to the file. Then the smell hit me. Faint but unmistakable. The scent of damp soil, cold and cloying, mixed with something vaguely sweet like wilting flowers on a grave. My head snapped up. The vents in this place were notorious for pulling in strange odors from the street, but this was different. This smelled like the earth in those woods where I'd searched for Lily. I pushed my chair back, the wheels groaning in the silence, and stood up. My joints ached, a constant reminder that I wasn't the young, tireless detective I used to be. I walked to the door of my office and looked down the long, shattered corridor. It was empty, illuminated only by the sickly green glow of the emergency exit signs at the far end. Nothing seemed out of place. I was about to turn back to chalk it up to an old man's overactive imagination, fueled by caffeine and morbid memories, when I saw it. For no more than a second, standing in the middle of the hallway, right where the shadows were deepest, was a small figure. It was indistinct, little more than a silhouette against the gloom, but it was unmistakably the shape of a child, or more accurately, a large doll. It was perfectly still. I didn't breathe. I didn't blink. My entire world narrowed to one dark shape. My heart wasn't racing, it was doing the opposite, beating with a slow, heavy, painful rhythm like a funeral drum. A fluorescent light overhead chose that exact moment to flicker, buzzing erratically. It blinked once, plunging the hallway into near total darkness for a split second. When the light came back on, the hallway was empty. It was just gone. My logical mind, my trusted shield, kicked into gear immediately. A trick of the light, a shadow. My eyes, strained from hours of reading, had played a prank on me. It was nothing. But the cold dread that had seeped into my marrow knew better. It knew that what I had seen was real, and it was just the beginning. I didn't call out, I didn't run for the light switch. Years of training kept my body moving, even when my mind was reeling. I walked, my footsteps unnaturally loud on the linoleum, down the entire length of the hallway. I ran my hand along the wall where the shape had been. The painted brick was cold, but one spot, right where it had stood, was like ice, a deep, penetrating cold that had nothing to do with the building's faulty heating. I checked every door I passed, the forensics lab, the interrogation rooms, the archives, all locked tight for the night. There was no one else on the floor, no way in, no way out. I stood there for a long time, at the far end of the hall, just staring back at my empty, brightly lit office, a small island of supposed sanity in an ocean of encroaching darkness. The smell of grave dirt was gone, replaced by the familiar scent of industrial cleaner. It was as if nothing had happened, but something had. I went back to my desk, gathered my things, and stuffed the case file into my briefcase, my hands moving on autopilot. I couldn't look at the missing girl's face anymore. The work was impossible now. The quiet dread that settled over me was a different kind of fear from a gun in my face or a cornered suspect. This was a fear that came from within.
It was the terrifying, sinking realization that the lock on the cage where I kept my ghosts had just been broken. And the worst part was, I knew with a certainty that defied all logic that I was the one who had given it the key. I drove home that night through slick, empty streets, the city lights bleeding together into watercolor smears on my windshield. My apartment, usually a refuge of quiet order, felt different, unwelcoming. I'd lived in the same place for 20 years, small second-floor walk-up filled with books and old case files. I knew every creak of the floorboards, every groan of the ancient plumbing, but that night, every familiar sound seemed alien, menacing. I double-checked the lock on my door, something I hadn't done in years, and left the chain on. Sleep didn't come. I lay in the dark, staring at the ceiling, my mind replaying that fleeting image in the hallway. A trick of the light, it had to be. I was 57 years old, overworked and haunted by a ghost of my own making. Stress manifests in strange ways. The human brain is a notoriously unreliable narrator. I repeated these rationalizations like a mantra, a prayer to the god of logic I had served my whole life. But the cold spot on the wall, the smell of damp earth, those weren't so easy to dismiss. Around 3 in the morning, I gave up on sleep and went to the kitchen to make coffee, the last resort of the troubled. As the machine gurgled and hissed, I stood by the window, looking out at the rain-swept alley below. And then I heard it again. Not a scrape this time, but a soft, rhythmic thump. Thump, thump, thump. It was coming from the living room. My hand went instinctively to my side where my service weapon would normally be, but I was home and it was locked in its case in the bedroom. I grabbed the heaviest thing I could find, a cast iron skillet, and crept towards the sound. The thumping stopped. Absolute silence descended on the apartment, a silence so profound it felt like a pressure against my eardrums. I took a deep breath, steeling myself, and pushed the living room door open. The room was empty, exactly as I'd left it. The worn leather armchair, the overflowing bookshelves, the faint outline of the city through the large window. Nothing. Then my eyes fell on the floor in the center of the room. Lying there, on the worn patch of my Persian rug, was a single faded red ribbon.
I spent the next 2 days in a state of hyper-vigilant denial. I went to work, I drank the terrible coffee, I stared at the files on my desk. I told no one about what I had seen. Who would I tell? What would I say? That I saw a ghost doll in the hallway and found a ribbon from a 10-year-old cold case on my living room floor? They'd have me on psychiatric leave before the words were even out of my mouth. So, I did what I do best. I investigated. I started with the precinct. I pulled the security footage from Tuesday night. The cameras were old, the resolution grainy, but they worked. I sat in the dark video monitoring room for hours, fast-forwarding and rewinding, my eyes burning from the screen. The footage showed exactly what you'd expect. Me, working late, walking out into the hallway, standing there for a minute, and then walking back. The hallway was empty. There was no flicker of the lights, no dark shape, no silhouette. Nothing. It wasn't there. A wave of relief, so powerful it almost made me dizzy, washed over me. I was losing my mind. It was a simple, terrifying, but ultimately rational explanation. I was cracking under the pressure. I could deal with that. I could see a therapist, take a vacation. I couldn't deal with the alternative. Feeling emboldened, I went back to my apartment with a renewed sense of purpose. The ribbon was the key. If I could explain the ribbon, I could explain everything. It had to have come from somewhere. Maybe it fell out of an old evidence box I'd brought home. I hadn't touched the Lily case files in years, but it was possible. I tore my apartment apart. I went through every box in my closet, every stack of papers, every dusty corner of my life. I found old photographs, forgotten commendations, a lifetime of meticulously organized failure. But no box from the Lily case. The ribbon remained an anomaly, a single damning piece of evidence against my sanity. My investigation, my desperate attempt to rebuild the logical wall around my world, was leading me nowhere. All it did was make me more aware of the little things, the subtle disturbances that I had previously ignored. A sudden chill in a warm room, the faint, cloying scent of grave dirt that would hang in the air for a moment and then vanish, the distinct feeling of being watched when I was alone. I started to feel like a character in one of the crackpot paranormal cases I was supposed to be debunking. The skepticism that had been my armor was corroding from the inside out. My point of no return came on Friday night. I was driving home from another long, fruitless day, my mind a tangled mess of denial and creeping dread. I decided on a whim to take a different route. A long, winding road that led past the old wooded park on the edge of town. The same woods where we had searched for Lily. I told myself I just wanted a change of scenery, but I knew I was lying. I was being pulled there. I parked the car by the side of the road, the engine ticking as it cooled. The woods were dark and silent under a moonless sky. I got out of the car, the night air cold on my face. A sense of profound wrongness settled over me. This was a mistake. I should get back in the car and drive away. But my feet felt rooted to the spot. I looked toward the tree line, and that's when I saw it. It wasn't a silhouette this time. It was there, clear as day, standing just inside the woods, partially hidden behind the trunk of a large oak tree. The doll. It was exactly as I had imagined it for a decade. A perfect, horrifying manifestation of my deepest fears. The cracked porcelain of its face seemed to glow with a faint, sickly luminescence. Its tattered yellow dress was stained and dark, clinging to its small frame. Its one good glass eye caught the distant city lights, reflecting them back at me with a cold, dead intelligence. And in its small, porcelain hand, it was holding another red ribbon.
For a moment that stretched into an eternity, I was paralyzed. My entire career, my entire belief system was built on the foundation that things like this didn't happen. Monsters were human, ghosts were grief. But the thing standing in the woods defied every rational explanation. The cold dread from the precinct hallway returned, but this time it was a tidal wave, crashing over me, stealing the air from my lungs. The doll didn't move. It just stood there, a silent, mocking sentinel at the edge of the darkness. Then, slowly, it raised its other hand and pointed, not at me, but deeper into the woods. A silent invitation, an order, and a sound began to echo from the trees, a sound that chilled me more than the sight of the doll itself. It was the faint, tinkling music of a child's music box, playing a slow, off-key lullaby. It was the same lullaby that had played from the mobile above Lily's crib. Her parents had told me. My training, my instincts, everything screamed at me to get back in the car, to drive away and never look back. But I couldn't. The guilt I had carried for 10 years was a chain, and this thing, this doll, held the other end. It was showing me something, a clue, a chance after all this time to finally know what happened to her, to fix my failure. It was a lie, a beautiful, tempting lie, and I walked right into it. I pushed through the tangled undergrowth, the branches clawing at my coat, my eyes fixed on the doll. It remained just ahead, always slightly out of reach, leading me deeper and deeper into the suffocating darkness of the woods. The music box melody grew louder, more distorted, the cheerful notes twisting into something sorrowful and menacing. The doll led me to a small, forgotten clearing. In the center was a shallow depression in the earth, barely visible beneath a decade of fallen leaves. The music stopped. The woods fell silent. The doll was gone. I was alone. But I knew
with a sick certainty what this place was. This was where Lily had ended up. This was her grave. My failure was no longer an abstract concept. It was the cold, damp earth beneath my feet. I fell to my knees, the grief and guilt of 10 years finally breaking through my carefully constructed walls. I had failed her. I had failed her parents. I had failed everything I was supposed to be. And in that moment of absolute despair, the trap sprang. The world around me dissolved. The trees, the clearing, the night sky, it all melted away into a thick, suffocating blackness. I wasn't in the woods anymore. I was somewhere else. A void, a place of absolute silence and cold, and I was not alone. The doll was there, but it was different now. It was no longer a small, static figure. It grew. Its porcelain limbs stretching and cracking, its form twisting into a grotesque caricature of a human child. Its one good eye burned with a cold, ancient malice. The empty socket was a swirling vortex of blackness, and from it I could hear whispers, the echoes of a child's pain, her fear, her rage at being abandoned and not being saved. It was the spirit that wore the doll, and it was feeding on my despair. It showed me images, not illusions, but memories, my own failures, played back in excruciating detail. I saw Lily's parents, their faces etched with a grief I couldn't heal. I saw every cold case file, every victim I couldn't save, every family I couldn't give closure to. It was a symphony of my professional and personal inadequacies. The entity wasn't just the reminder of my failure with Lily, it was the embodiment of all my failures. It was a mirror reflecting the deepest, most secret fear of every detective, that in the end, we don't make a difference at all, that the darkness always wins. I tried to fight back, to cling for logic, to reason. I scrambled backwards trying to find the edge of this void and escape. But there was no escape. The void was me. It was the emptiness I had carried inside me for a decade. The doll, the spirit, it hadn't created this place. It had just opened the door. It reached for me, its cracked porcelain fingers extending, not to touch me, but to pass through me. As it did, I felt a coldness that was not of this world. It wasn't a physical sensation, it was the draining of my will, my hope, my very essence. My memories of purpose, of justice, of the desire to help, they were being siphoned away, replaced by the crunching weight of its despair and my guilt. My life's work, my entire identity, it was being erased, not from the world, but from me. I was becoming as hollow as its empty eye socket.
The final image burned into my consciousness was not the monstrous, distorted doll, but the original. The small, broken thing with the tattered yellow dress and the one good eye. It stood over me in the void, and for the first time, I saw not malice in its gaze, but a profound, unending sadness. The vengeful spirit of a child who was never saved, who was failed by the world, had found its perfect home. It had found someone who felt the guilt that its own tormentor never had. It had found me. The crushing weight of its despair became my own. My guilt was no longer just about Lily, it was about this child too. Another child I couldn't save. It was the perfect, eternal punishment. Not death, but a life sentence in a prison of my own failure. My soul a vessel for a child's unending rage and sorrow. I don't know how long I was in that void. Time had no meaning there. But eventually, the blackness receded, and I found myself back on the cold, damp earth of the clearing. The sun was rising, its weak light filtering through the trees. My body was numb, my mind a hollowed-out cavern. I stood up, my movements stiff and automatic. I was still a detective. I still had a badge. But the man, Miles Corbin, the one who built a wall of logic to keep the darkness out, was gone. The doll had won. It hadn't killed me. It had done something far worse. It had taken the one thing that kept me going, the desperate hope that I could make things right, and replaced it with the cold, hard certainty that I never could. The guilt I had carried for 10 years was no longer a burden. It was now the very foundation of my being, the ghost in my own machine. I walked out of the woods that morning, a shell of a man, leaving the shallow, unmarked grave behind. The doll wasn't with me, not in any physical sense. It didn't need to be. It was inside me now. Its one good eye staring out at the world through my own, a constant, mocking reminder of a promise I could never keep and a child I would never save.
Most people think I'm crazy for loving the night shift. My colleagues, the day traders who thrive on the opening bell's chaotic symphony, they see my hours as a kind of self-imposed exile. They picture me up here on the 27th floor, alone in a glass and steel tomb, and they pity me. But they don't get it. They don't understand that the silence isn't an absence of life, it's the presence of control. Down below, the city of London is a sleeping beast, its frantic, unpredictable energy finally tamed by the moon. Up here, it's just me, the gentle hum of the servers, and the sprawling, silent constellations of data on my 6 monitors. Every night is a ritual. I arrive at 10 p.m. sharp. My coffee mug, a simple ceramic thing, is placed exactly 2 centimeters from the top right corner of my mousepad. My keyboard is aligned perfectly with the edge of the desk. The market I trade, the Asian session, is just waking up. It's a calmer market, more predictable, less prone to the emotional, knee-jerk reactions of New York or London. It's a world of patterns, of logic, of cause and effect. And in that world, I am a god. I can see the ripples before they become waves. I can predict the whispers before they become screams. This order, this meticulous, obsessive control, it's not just a preference, it's my armor. It's the wall I've built, brick by painful brick, around the memory of a day when I learned that chaos is the only true devil. You see, I'm the son of a gambler who called himself a day trader. My father lived for the chaos my colleagues now thrive in. He chased the volatile, high-risk stocks, riding the adrenaline of massive swings. Our little house didn't feel like a home. It felt like a casino's back room, smelling of stale coffee, sweat, and my father's alternating currents of manic joy and crushing despair. The market wasn't just his job, it was the monster he wrestled every single day, and we were all just collateral damage. I was 12 the day the monster finally won. It was a Tuesday. I remember the sickly yellow light of the afternoon sun slanting through the blinds, dust motes dancing in the air like tiny, indifferent ghosts. My father was staring at his monitor, the same way I do now, but his face was a mask of horror. The green and red lines on his screen, the ones he called his beautiful, wild horses, had collapsed into a single, brutal, blood-red waterfall. He didn't shout. He didn't scream. He just made this small, guttural sound, like an animal being gutted. Then he slowly, methodically began to destroy his office. He didn't just break things, he dismantled our lives, piece by piece, with a terrifying, silent precision. That day, I didn't just lose our home and my sense of security, I watched the man who was supposed to be my protector be devoured by a force he couldn't see or reason with. I learned that the world is fundamentally, terrifyingly random. And I swore to myself with the fierce, desperate conviction only a terrified child can muster that I would never, ever be at the mercy of chaos again. So I chose the night. I chose the quiet. I built a life that was the complete antithesis of my father's, a fortress of routine where every variable was accounted for, every outcome calculated. But in the deepest, most silent hours of the morning, when the city outside is utterly still and the only sound is the click of my own mouse, I sometimes feel a different kind of fear. It's not the fear of a sudden crash or a violent downturn. It's a subtle, creeping dread. It's the fear of the routine itself. There's an urban legend among the night shift workers in the financial district, a story whispered over burnt coffee in sterile break rooms. They call it the perpetual shift. The story goes that sometimes a person can get so lost in their routine, so locked into the rhythm of their work, that the work just never ends. It's not about being overworked. It's about being overwritten. Your existence becomes a single, looping task. You become a ghost in the machine, a soul trapped in a spreadsheet, forever reconciling a column that never balances. I always dismissed it as a stupid story, a metaphor for burnout. But the thing that scares me, the thing that I've never admitted to anyone, is that I secretly understand it. The horror isn't chaos. The ultimate horror is order. Perfect, absolute, eternal order. A prison where the walls are made of your own habits.
The night it started was like any other. It was Wednesday, or technically Thursday morning. The markets were placid, moving in the gentle, predictable waves I knew so well. I had a good position open on the Nikkei, a small but certain profit ticking upwards with every passing minute. At around 2 in the morning, a flag popped up on my system. It was a routine alert, a minor data reconciliation task for a block of trades from the previous day. It was nothing, a simple 5-minute job I'd done thousands of times. It was the kind of mindless, repetitive task that was almost meditative for me. Click a few boxes, run a verification script, and sign off. I glanced at the atomic clock in the corner of my main monitor. 2:17 a.m. I sipped my coffee, perfectly brewed as always, and set about the task. I opened the ledger, highlighted the corresponding data block, and clicked the Reconcile button. The progress bar appeared, a satisfying blue line sliding across the small dialog box. It reached 100%. The box should have vanished, replaced by a green completed check mark. It didn't. It just froze. At first, it was just an annoyance, a system glitch. In a building this technologically advanced, it was rare, but it happened. The cursor still moved, a lonely white arrow skating over a frozen digital landscape. I tried to bring up the task manager. Nothing. The keyboard was dead. I sighed, the sound loud in the cavernous, empty office. A hard reboot was the only answer. It would mess with my flow, a small, irritating crack in the perfect porcelain of my night. I leaned down, my finger reaching for the physical power button on the tower beneath my desk, but just as my skin was about to make contact, the screen flickered. The frozen dialog box vanished, and the interface reset itself to the exact moment before I'd started. The ledger was open, the data block still highlighted, waiting, as if the last 60 seconds had been erased. I frowned, a prickle of unease on my neck. I looked at the clock. 2:17 a.m. That was impossible. I distinctly remembered a minute passing, maybe more. I must have been more tired than I thought. Shaking my head, I started again. My movements now more deliberate, more precise. I clicked the boxes in their proper sequence. Click, click, click. Run script. The blue progress bar slid across the box again, a perfect replica of the last time. It hit 100%, and it froze. My breath caught in my throat. This time, I didn't move. I just watched, waited. And just like before, after about a minute of unyielding stillness, the screen flickered and reset. The ledger sat there, patiently waiting. My eyes darted to the clock.
2:17 a.m. A cold, heavy dread began to seep into my bones, a chilling fog that had nothing to do with the building's aggressive air conditioning. This wasn't a glitch. Glitches were random, chaotic. This was methodical. This was a pattern. This was a perfect, unbroken loop. I tried it a third time, then a fourth, my heart hammering against my ribs. Every single time the result was identical. The same actions, the same freeze, the same reset. The clock on my screen remained defiantly, mockingly stuck at 2:17 a.m. My meticulously constructed world of order and predictability had turned on me. The routine had become a cage. I pushed my chair back, the rolling casters making no sound on the polished floor. I needed to break the sequence, to do something different. I stood up and walked to the vast floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the slumbering city. The view, usually a source of calm and dominion, now felt like a painted backdrop. The endless river of headlights on the M25 was gone. The cars were all static, frozen in place like toys. A plane, its lights blinking, hung in the sky, unmoving. A permanent scar against the dark velvet. The entire world had been paused. The creeping stillness I'd always felt in the dead of night wasn't just a feeling anymore. It was real. I was alone, trapped on the 27th floor of a dead building in the middle of a dead city in a single eternal minute. I turned back to my desk, to the glowing screens that were my life's work. The reconciliation alert was still blinking, a patient, persistent pulse. It had a job for me to do, and I had all the time in the world to do it.
I don't know how many times I repeated the task. 10? 100? Time had lost its meaning, tethered as it was to that single, unchanging minute. My mind, usually a fortress of logic, was starting to fray. I was a rat in a digital maze, hitting the same invisible wall again and again. Finally, with a strangled cry that was swallowed by the oppressive silence, I shoved myself away from the desk, sending my chair rolling back several feet. I couldn't look at the screen anymore. The blinking alert felt like a malevolent eye, watching me, judging my failure. I stumbled away, my legs stiff, my breath coming in shallow, ragged bursts. I needed to walk, to move, to do anything other than click that button. I found myself at the far end of the trading floor, near the fire exit, and that's when I saw it. The door to the server room, a heavy, windowless slab of metal 50 meters away, was slightly ajar. A sliver of absolute, impenetrable darkness was visible in the gap. Now, you have to understand that door is never, ever left open. It's a bastion of security controlled by a keypad and a biometric scanner. I am the only person on this floor with the code and the clearance. And I know, with a certainty that was as absolute as my own name, that I had locked it when I did my initial sweep of the floor hours ago. It was part of the ritual. Yet, there it was, a blatant, screaming violation of the rules. My heart, which had been a frantic drum, suddenly went cold and still. The fear wasn't a rush of adrenaline, it was a slow, creeping paralysis. I watched the door, expecting something, anything to emerge from that slice of black. Nothing did. But then, as my eyes adjusted, I saw something else. On the main trading floor, nestled among the dozens of identical, dormant workstations, one console was active. A single, tiny red light blinked on its surface. It was a maintenance light, one that only came on when a technician physically activated it from a panel inside the machine's tower. It blinked with a steady, metronomic tempo. Blink, pause, blink, pause. It was a perfect, unwavering tempo. My blood turned to ice. It wasn't the light itself or even the open door. It was the perfection of it. The rhythm of the blink was flawless, inhumanly so. The gap in the doorway was a perfect, clean-edged rectangle of void. These weren't random errors, they were deliberate, precise installations of chaos into my world of order. And as I stood there, frozen, I became aware of a new sound, or rather, the corruption of an old one. The gentle, ambient hum of the servers, the sound that was the constant, reassuring heartbeat of my world, had changed. It was still there, but it was flatter, a single monotonous synthetic tone that seemed to vibrate not in the air but directly inside my skull. The sound of a machine with no purpose, running eternally for no reason. I wasn't just in a time loop, I was in a room with something that was actively, intelligently, and methodically taking my reality apart piece by perfect piece. My first instinct wasn't to run, it was to fix it. That's how my mind works. See a problem, diagnose it, solve it, restore order. The terror was there, a cold knot in my stomach, but the compulsion to correct the errors was stronger. This was my sanctuary, and it had been violated. I refused to accept what I was seeing. There had to be a logical explanation. A power surge, a system-wide diagnostic I hadn't been informed of, a catastrophic failure in the building's security mainframe. Anything but the alternative my trembling subconscious was screaming at me. I began a new ritual, a frantic pilgrimage of control. I marched to the server room door, my footsteps echoing unnaturally in the dead air. The metal of the handle was cold, inert. I pushed it shut. The heavy magnetic lock clicked into place with a satisfying final thud. One problem solved. Next, the blinking light. I strode to the offending console, my jaw clenched. I avoided looking at the other desks, terrified of what other small rebellions I might find. I knelt down, my hands surprisingly steady as I found the power switch on the tower. I pressed it, the red light went out. The console was dead again, just as it should be. 2 problems solved. I felt a sliver of my old power return. This was manageable. This was just a series of errors that needed correcting. My fear was an overreaction, a product of exhaustion and stress. I decided to run a full diagnostic from the floor's central security terminal, a small, isolated desk in the corner. I would check the door logs, the power consumption records for every console, the CCTV feeds. I would find the glitch, and I would patch it. As I walked to the security terminal, I kept my eyes fixed forward, refusing to look back at the server room door or the console I had just fixed. Looking back would be admitting doubt, and doubt was a luxury I couldn't afford. The security terminal hummed to life under my touch. I brought up the logs for the server room door. According to the system, the door had not been open in 7 hours. It had been sealed shut since I first arrived. I felt a wave of dizziness. The log was lying, or I was losing my mind. I typed furiously, my fingers flying across the keyboard, pulling up the power records. The console with the blinking red light? According to the system, it had drawn no power. It was and had always been completely off. A cold sweat broke out on my forehead. The data, my holy scripture, the one thing in the universe I trusted implicitly, was telling me that what I had seen with my own eyes had not happened. The system was perfect. The logs were perfect. Therefore, the error had to be me. The thought was so terrifying that I almost couldn't breathe. Was this what a breakdown felt like? A silent internal collapse where the walls of reality just dissolved? Was this how my father felt in those final moments before he started smashing things? A man betrayed by the numbers he had built his life on? No, I wouldn't let that happen. There was one last bastion of truth, one final objective witness. The CCTV. I pulled up the camera feeds. There were a dozen angles covering the trading floor. I selected the camera with the clearest view of the server room and the blinking console. I spooled back the footage to a few minutes ago. I watched myself on the screen, a lonely, gray figure in an empty, gray room. I saw myself stumble away from my desk. I saw myself stare into the distance for several long, unnerving minutes. And then I saw myself march with grim determination towards nothing. On the screen, the server room door was shut. The console was dark. I was a madman walking across an empty floor to close a door that was already closed, and to turn off a light that was never on. I watched the video, my own ghost performing a ritual for an audience of 1. And as I stared at my own inexplicable actions on the screen, the new alert popped up in the corner of the security monitor. A small, innocuous, text-only box. It read, "Unauthorized access detected. Camera feed 7B." It was the feed I was currently watching. My blood ran cold. The system wasn't just wrong, it was actively rewriting itself, covering its tracks in real time. It knew I was watching. The entity, this perpetual shift, was not just a passive presence, it was intelligent. It was toying with me. The realization hit me like a physical blow. My investigation, my desperate attempt to impose logic on the situation had been nothing but a game it had allowed me to play. I was no longer a god in my own domain. I was a specimen in a jar and something was tapping on the glass. I pushed back from the security desk, a raw, primal fear finally overwhelming my need for control. I had to get out. Not just out of the office, but out of the building. The ritual was broken, the sanctuary was a trap, and the only sane move left was to flee. I ran, my polished leather shoes slipping on the linoleum. I didn't head for the main elevators. Some instinct told me they wouldn't work. I ran for the fire exit, the same one I had drifted towards earlier. The heavy metal bar on the door felt blessedly real and solid under my palm. I slammed my weight against it. The door swung open, not into the expected concrete-walled stairwell, but into an exact replica of the office I had just fled. I skidded to a halt, my mind refusing to process what my eyes were seeing. It was the trading floor, the same rows of desks, the same dark monitors, the same oppressive silence. At the far end, I could see my own workstation, the screen still glowing, the reconciliation alert still patiently blinking. I looked behind me. The fire exit I had just come through was gone, replaced by a smooth, seamless wall. There was no door. There was no escape. It was at that moment that the true nature of the horror began to reveal itself. It wasn't just about looping time or minor inconsistencies. It was about the corruption of space itself. The geometry of my prison was fluid, malevolent. My attempts to flee had only drawn me deeper into the maze. The subtle distortions I'd feared were no longer subtle. I could feel it now, a low, thrumming vibration through the soles of my feet. The perfectly aligned rows of desks seemed to gently, almost imperceptibly shift and rearrange themselves when I wasn't looking directly at them. The ceiling, which I knew to be a standard 10-foot height, felt oppressively low one moment and impossibly high the next. The air itself felt thick, viscous, like I was breathing water. The clinical scent of disinfectant was gone, replaced by the smell of ozone and old decaying paper, the smell of forgotten art.
Panic, raw and unfiltered, finally tore through the last of my composure. My breath hitched in my throat, each gasp a painful scraping thing. The carefully constructed dam of my control didn't just crack, it exploded. All at once, every inconsistency I had tried to ignore or correct returned. But this time, they multiplied, they spawned, they swarmed. It was an infestation of broken rules. The red maintenance light I had extinguished now blinked on every single console, 100 crimson eyes opening in the dark, all pulsing in a maddening unified rhythm. Every door on the floor, to the conference rooms, the private offices, the kitchen, swung open and shut in a silent, perfectly synchronized wave. Open, shut, open, shut. A sea of gaping mouths, whispering nothing. My own workstation was the epicenter of the chaos. The single reconciliation alert had replicated, covering all 6 of my monitors, a cascade of identical error messages, all frozen at 100%, all demanding my attention. The clock, which had been stuck at 2:17 a.m., now flickered through impossible times, 34, 98, 12, FF, A1, 00, a digital scream of corrupted data. The hum became a roar, a physical pressure against my eardrums. I could feel the entity's presence now, not as a creature, but as an overwhelming sense of purpose, a vast, idiotic, grinding purpose. The purpose of a machine that does nothing but run. Its only goal was to make me run, too. And I did. I ran. My mind snapped back to its primary directive, fix the errors.
I became a frantic parody of my former self, a whirlwind of futile actions. I lunged at a monitor, my fingers flying across the keyboard, trying to close one of the 100 alerts. As I typed, the letters on the screen rearranged themselves into the word again. I slammed the window closed, and 2 more instantly popped up in its place. I spun around and sprinted to the nearest swinging door, grabbing the handle and forcing it shut, my muscles screaming in protest. As I locked it, the one directly behind me swung open with a soft, mocking click. I scrambled over desks, my neat stacks of paper scattering like startled birds to extinguish another blinking light, only to see 3 more flicker to life in my peripheral vision. It was a nightmare designed by a mad god who had read my soul. My obsession with order had become the engine of my own torture. Every corrective action I took was a signal to the entity, a proof of my engagement, a confirmation that I was playing the game. And it responded by escalating, by creating more chaos for me to fix, feeding on my desperation. Flashes of my father's face, pale and horrified, in the glow of his own failing monitor, seared my vision. The smell of his sweat, of his despair, filled my nostrils. I could feel his frantic energy, the horrifying realization that the system he trusted had turned into an unpredictable beast. But my beast wasn't unpredictable. It was worse. It was infinitely, perfectly, predictably cruel. The routine was still there, but it was no longer mine. I was just a cog in a much larger, much more terrible machine. I don't know how long I ran around in that mad circle of futility. Minutes? Hours? The concept was meaningless. My body was a machine running on pure, uncut adrenaline and terror. My lungs burned, my vision swam, but the compulsion to fix was absolute. It was the only thought left in my shattered mind. And slowly, my frantic, random movements began to find a new pattern, a new direction. It was as if the labyrinth itself was guiding me. A series of blinking lights would appear, leading me down a specific aisle. A swinging door would beckon me towards a particular corner of the office. The tasks were no longer just repeating, they were evolving, leading me on a horrifying breadcrumb trail. The goal was no longer to restore order to the trading floor, but to follow the path of tasks laid out before me. It was a new routine, a new purpose, and my broken mind latched onto it with the desperation of a drowning man. The path led me, inevitably, to the fire exit, the one that previously led back into the office. This time when I pushed the bar, it opened into the cold concrete reality of the stairwell. A wave of relief so profound it was sickening washed over me. An escape. But it wasn't an escape. It was just the next level of the game. At the bottom of the stairs, the exit sign was dark, but at the top, a single bare bulb flickered, casting a weak yellow light on the sign for the roof access. That was the inconsistency. The light at the bottom was off. The one at the top was on. The task was clear. I had to go up. I began to climb, my steps heavy and automatic. Each flight of stairs was identical. Gray concrete, steel railing, 28 steps. Landing, turned, 28 more steps. With each floor I passed, the hum from the office below faded, replaced by a profound, unnatural silence. The only sound was my own ragged breathing and the rhythmic scuff of my shoes on the steps. I was no longer running from anything. I was completing a function. The panic was gone, burned away, leaving behind a hollow, single-minded focus. Reach the roof. Correct the final error. When I finally reached the top landing, the door to the roof stood before me. It was heavy, steel, and painted a faded industrial red. And it was slightly ajar. The final task. I placed my hands on the cold metal and pushed. It swung open with a low groan, and I stepped out into the frozen, silent night. The wind didn't blow, the air didn't move. The city below was a static photograph of light and shadow. I turned back to the door, my final act of control. I pulled it shut. It clicked into its frame with a sound of absolute finality. A perfect, sealed lock. The task was done. I waited for the sense of relief. A victory. It never came. I reached out to try the handle to confirm my work was complete. It wouldn't turn. I was locked out. The realization was a quiet one, a final, devastating whisper in the ruins of my mind. I had been led here. I had followed the routine. I had completed the task, and the result was this: the ultimate, irreversible loss of control, trapped between a frozen sky and a dead city, in a place where I could change nothing. There were no more tasks, no more errors to fix. There was only the perfect, terrible, unending stillness. I looked down at the 27th floor drop, and for the first time since I was 12 years old, I understood. The only way to truly escape the system is to crash it completely.
The next morning, Maria, the head of the cleaning crew, unlocked the doors to the trading floor at precisely 6 a.m., just as she did every day. The air inside was cool and sterile, smelling faintly of disinfectant. Everything was exactly as it should be. The keyboards were aligned with the desks, the chairs were pushed in, the monitors were dark. Everything, that is, except for Julian. He was still in his chair, slumped over his workstation. Maria sighed. These traders, they work themselves to death. She approached him cautiously, ready to tell him to go home, that the day shift would be arriving soon. But there was something wrong. He was too still. His head was resting on his keyboard, and a small, ugly pool of saliva and foam had collected around his mouth, staining the pristine white plastic. His eyes were wide open, staring with a look of absolute, uncomprehending horror, not at the screens in front of him, but at something far, far beyond them. His fingers were still resting on the keys, frozen in the middle of some final, unfinished command. There was no sign of a struggle. The coroner would later say it was a massive cerebral hemorrhage, an aneurysm brought on by extreme stress. A tragic, but not entirely uncommon story in the high-stakes world of finance. They would say he died working, but they were wrong. He died from the unbearable weight of a world without purpose, from an order so absolute it had suffocated his soul. He had spent his entire life running from the explosive, unpredictable chaos that had destroyed his father, only to be meticulously, quietly, and methodically dismantled by its opposite. He had built a fortress of routine to keep the monsters out, never realizing that the most patient monster of all was the routine itself, waiting for the day it could lock the final door behind him and present him with a single, eternal, and utterly meaningless task.
Of survival. My laboratory is a testament to it. Every pipette is aligned in its rack by volume. Every data point is cataloged in triplicate across encrypted servers. Every cryovial is labeled with a precision that borders on obsession. I am a molecular biologist, you see. I spend my days mapping the very code of life, finding the predictable, beautiful logic in the seeming chaos of existence. It's what I'm good at. It's the only thing that has ever kept me safe. For the last decade, I've been working on the ultimate puzzle: consciousness, the human mind. Not in a philosophical, abstract sense, but in a tangible, biological one. I'm not searching for a soul. I'm tracing the neural pathways, decoding the cascading protein signals that hold our memories, our fears, our very sense of self. My goal has always been simple, if ambitious, to build a fail-safe, a protocol, a molecular reinforcement, a way to make the mind immune to the decay I know is not just possible, but inevitable. I need to prove that the self isn't some fragile ghost in the machine, but a fortress of logic that can be understood, repaired, and ultimately controlled. It's a strange fixation for a man of science, I concede. But my obsession wasn't born in a sterile lab. It was born in a silent, sun-drenched room, watching my father disappear. He was a brilliant man, a theoretical physicist whose mind danced with cosmic theories I could barely comprehend. To me, he was a giant. Then the giant fell. It wasn't sudden, like a stroke. It was a slow, terrifying erosion, like a coastline giving way to the sea. His memories started to fray at the edges. He'd forget my name, then my mother's. His logic unraveled. He would spend hours trying to solve simple equations he had once scribbled on napkins as a party trick. One day, he just stopped. He was physically there, a man of 63 breathing in a chair by the window, but his mind was gone, wiped clean. He'd become a vessel, his eyes tracing the path of dust motes and the sunlight, trapped in a silent, empty space I couldn't reach. That emptiness is my ghost. It's the horror I've dedicated my life to outrunning. While other people feared death or pain or things that go bump in the night, I feared that silent catatonic nothingness, the complete and total loss of self. My father's fate became the blueprint for my terror, and my work has been a 45-year-long attempt to build a world where that blueprint can be methodically, logically, and permanently burned. I thought I could control it. I believed with every fiber of my being that my intellect could build a wall so high and so reinforced that the silence could never get in. I was wrong. And this is the story of the day I opened the door and let it in myself. It all started with a patent, a complex protein folding problem. A potential key to synaptic reinforcement had me stumped for weeks. It was a knot of impossibly elegant biology that refused to yield to my simulations, its tertiary structure collapsing in every model. Frustrated, I decided to take a more direct approach. For years, I'd been mapping my own neural activity during REM sleep, cross-referencing it with my research into consciousness. My hypothesis was that I could induce and maintain a stable, controllable, lucid dream state, a mental sandbox where I could manipulate complex models with the speed of thought, free from the physical constraints of processors and code. It was arrogant, I know, but the problem was irresistible, and the potential reward, a new patent and a quantum leap forward in my work, was too great to ignore. My first attempt was a staggering, unqualified success. I lay down on the cot in my private lab, the hum of the servers a familiar lullaby. I affixed the EEG leads to my temples, the cool gel a small, tactile anchor. I followed my own protocol, a sequence of breathing exercises, mnemonic triggers, and targeted frequency modulation from the EEG. The transition was seamless. One moment I was aware of the cool leather of the cot, the next I was standing in a perfect, thought-form replica of my lab. I could feel the precise 20 degrees centigrade chill of the air on my skin. I could smell the faint, clean scent of ozone from the sterilizer. It was flawless. The protein model floated before me, a shimmering cascade of ribbons and helixes, more vivid than any computer simulation. I reached out and pulled it apart, refolded it, tested bond angles with the flick of my wrist.
The process was intuitive, instantaneous. I was no longer interpreting data, I was the data. Time dilated. Hours of complex calculations were performed in what felt like minutes. I had complete and absolute control. But as I was finalizing the sequence, a flicker. In the polished chrome reflection of a centrifuge lid, a shadow moved behind me. It was tall and thin, gone before I could properly register its form. I stopped, my focus broken. I turned. The lab was empty. I walked to the centrifuge and ran a spectral analysis on its surface within the dream, searching for a light anomaly. Nothing. I dismissed it. A stray thought, a glitch in the simulation, a piece of mental flotsam. It was an irrelevant variable. I woke up with the completed protein sequence burned into my memory and a sense of absolute intoxicating triumph. My mind was my own to command. The following week was a blur of activity. The sequence held. The patent was filed. My work was lauded. I had, in one night, achieved more than most researchers do in a lifetime. My fortress, I believed, was now unbreachable. Flush with this success, I decided to go back in. This wasn't about a problem to be solved. This was about exploration. It was about testing the limits of my control. I built the lab again from memory, but it felt different. The air was colder, the precise 20 degrees centigrade now holding a morgue-like chill. The familiar, comforting hum of the equipment was absent, leaving a dead, flat silence that seemed to absorb thought. An unnerving stillness had replaced the dynamic potential of the space. I ignored the growing unease, my logical mind attributing it to anticipation, a change in my own baseline emotional state affecting the simulation's parameters. I ran a mental diagnostic on the environment, checking for inconsistencies. Everything was where it should be, down to the last slide on the last tray. Then I saw it. It wasn't a flicker this time. Standing at the far end of the lab, partially obscured by a rack of cryo-storage tanks, was a figure. It was translucent, like a heat haze rising from asphalt, but it had a distinct shape. The stooped shoulders and thin, frail frame of my father in his final years. It didn't move. It just stood there, a silent, shimmering question mark in the heart of my controlled world. My breath caught in my throat. My meticulously constructed reality began to feel thin, fragile, like a projection on a screen that was about to tear. My scientific mind screamed that it was just a symbol, my subconscious dredging up old fears to process the recent breakthrough. It was a logical, acceptable explanation, but it felt like more. It felt like an intrusion. I focused my will, the same will that had effortlessly untangled proteins, and tried to delete the apparition. Delete object. It remained. End simulation. Nothing happened. Then, it turned its head. It didn't have a face, just a smooth, blurry ovoid of shimmering light, but I felt its gaze on me, and a pure, primal fear I hadn't felt since I was a child, watching my father stare blankly past me, shot through my veins. A cold cascade of adrenaline dumped into my system. I jolted awake, my heart hammering against my ribs, the image of that faceless, shimmering man seared in my mind. I sat up, panting, the smell of ozone and sterile air from the dream still haunting my senses. I had lost control. For days, I tried to rationalize it. I buried myself in data, analyzing the EEG readouts from the second dream, searching for an anomaly, a neural misfire, a spike in the temporal lobe that could explain the apparition. There was nothing. The data was clean. I told myself it was stress, a manifestation of the pressure I was under. My work has always been my fortress, my logic, the bricks and mortar. To admit that something from within my own mind could defy that logic
felt like a betrayal. It felt like the first hairline crack in the foundation of my entire life. But the memory of that silent, watching figure wouldn't fade. The fear was a cold stone in my gut. I had to know. I had to prove I was still in control, that this was a bug in the system that could be isolated and fixed. That was my fatal, arrogant mistake. I convinced myself that one more test, a final, fully documented dive, would allow me to isolate the variable, confront it, and prove it was nothing more than a harmless anomaly. I went in again last night. I didn't even bother to construct the lab. The moment I crossed over, I was in a long, sterile white hallway that wasn't from any memory I owned. It stretched into a vanishing point of perfect geometric infinity in both directions. The silence was absolute, a crushing physical weight that felt like the precursor to deafness. I was already lost. My mental anchor, the image of my lab, was gone. Panic began to bubble up, hot and acidic in my throat. I tried to force the simulation to change, to build my lab around me. But the white walls were implacable. My will had no effect here. I turned, and he was there, not 20 meters away, the translucent figure of my father. This time he wasn't just watching. He began to walk towards me, his movements slow, unnaturally smooth and utterly silent. His feet made no sound on the pristine white floor. I ran. I didn't think. I just turned and fled down that endless corridor, my heart pounding a frantic rhythm against the suffocating silence. I didn't dare look back, but I could feel him behind me, a cold presence gaining on me with that same unhurried pace. The white walls of the corridor began to blur, the floor dissolving under my feet into a gray mist. The world was unmaking itself around me. Finally, I risked a glance over my shoulder. The figure was closer now, only a few meters away, close enough for me to see its face clearly through the shimmering haze. But it wasn't a faceless blur anymore, and it wasn't my father's. He was my own face, stretched into a wide, vacant, and utterly malevolent grin. My own eyes, empty of recognition or reason, stared back at me. And as it reached me, its fingers elongated and translucent. The last of the corridor dissolved, plunging me into a featureless, blindingly white void. There is no time in the void. There is no sound, no smell, no up or down. There is only the searing, uniform white and the crushing, absolute silence. And me? At first, my mind, the orderly, logical instrument that I had spent a lifetime sharpening, fought back. It tried to impose structure on the formless. I started counting prime numbers, a methodical, rhythmic recitation against the nothingness. I reached 1,489, then 1,493, then the very concept of numbers began to feel alien, the symbols dissolving into a meaningless hum. I tried to rebuild my lab, brick by mental brick. I visualized every beaker, every centrifuge, every single labeled slide in its refrigerated tray. But the void was a perfect solvent. My creations would hold for a moment, shimmering like a desert mirage, before they were bleached away, reabsorbed into the relentless white. The silence was the worst part. It wasn't just an absence of sound, it was an active, pressing presence. It pushed in on me, suffocating thought, making me yearn for the simple hum of a server. It was the same silence that had filled my father's room, and I knew, with a certainty that transcended logic, that I'd walked into my own self-made catatonia. My sense of self began to fray. Memories, once sharp and clear, became blurred. I fought to hold on to them. I pictured my wife, Eleanor, on our wedding day. I could see the lace on her dress, the pearls of her necklace, but her face was a smooth, hazy oval.
I try to recall the complex satisfaction of solving the protein equation. The memory was a hollow echo, the data corrupted beyond recovery. My mind, my fortress, was being dismantled from the inside out. I was becoming my father. A new terror emerged, the horror of forgetting what I was losing. Suddenly, a sound. After an eternity of silence, it was a physical blow, a soft, mocking chuckle that echoed in the non-space around me. I turned, and there he was, the doppelganger. My face, my body, standing 10 feet away, looking perfectly solid. The malevolent grin was wider now. It held up his hand, and in it was a pen, a simple, crimson-red fountain pen. My mind, what was left of it, screamed. Eleanor had given it to me for my 40th birthday. He raised the pen, its silver nib glinting in the non-light, and walked towards me with that same slow, smooth gait. I didn't run this time. There was nowhere to go. He stopped in front of me, his eyes, my eyes, empty of everything but a terrifying, vacant amusement. Then, with a swift, precise motion, he stabbed the pen deep into my left wrist. There was no pain, just a sudden, shocking cold. From the wound, there was no blood. Red ink, thick and viscous, pulsed out, staining the perfect white of the void. The color spread like a virus, a blooming stain of crimson that consumed the nothingness. The doppelganger watched, its smile widening as my world bled out. The red washed over me, warm and sticky. My knees buckled. My last coherent thought was not of my wife, or my work, or my life. It was a simple, stark realization. Order is an illusion. I woke with a gasp. The first thing I registered was the gentle weight of a high thread count duvet, the softness of a memory foam pillow beneath my head. My eyes fluttered open to a room bathed in the soft gray light of early morning. Sunlight streamed through a gap in the heavy curtains, illuminating dust motes dancing in the air like microscopic constellations. Beside me, a woman with dark, curling hair was sleeping, her breathing a soft, rhythmic whisper. For a moment, there was nothing, just the quiet, detached observation of a scene without context. Then, a sharp, throbbing ache flared in my left wrist. I lifted my arm from under the covers. There, on the pale skin of my inner wrist, was a wound, a deep, ragged puncture mark, crusted with dried blood that was almost black, surrounded by a faint, reddish stain as if ink had bled into the skin. It was impossible. It was real. I stared at the mark, a single, inexplicable data point. My heart began to pound, a frantic animal rhythm of fear, but the fear was nameless. It was a reaction without a cause. I looked around the room again. The furniture, a polished mahogany placer, a tall bookcase filled with leather-bound volumes, a framed photograph on the bedside table, was all perfectly arranged, clean and orderly. But it was the order of a stranger's house. I felt no connection to it, no flicker of recognition. I carefully picked up the photograph. It showed a smiling man who looked like me, his arm around the sleeping woman. They were standing on a beach. I felt nothing, no love, no familiarity, just a blank, hollow curiosity. Who was she? Who am I? The question landed in my mind with no weight, no echo. I searched for an answer, for a name, a memory, a single piece of data to anchor myself. I found nothing. It was like looking into a deep, empty well. There was no past, no future, only this single terrifying moment in an unfamiliar room. I swung my legs out of the bed, my movements clumsy, uncoordinated. I stood and walked to the large window, pulling back the heavy curtain. Below, a quiet suburban street slept under the rising sun, a world I did not know. I am a man. I am in a house. There is a wound on my arm. These are the only facts I possess. Everything else is gone, wiped clean. The great terror of my life, the ghost I chased with science and logic, was never about the mind breaking. It was about it being emptied. I had spent my entire life building a fortress to keep the silence out, only to discover that the silence was a part of its very foundation, waiting. I had stared into the void, and in my arrogance I had challenged it to a battle of wills. It did not fight back. It simply opened the door and welcomed me home. I looked at my reflection in the window pane. A man of about 45, with tired eyes and a face I did not recognize, stared back. He looked lost. He looked empty. He looked exactly like I remembered my father in his final years, sitting in that chair, staring at a world he could no longer comprehend. The circle was complete. The fail-safe had failed. The fortress was a tomb, and I, the man who believed in order, was now the ultimate chaos, a vessel without a self, trapped not in a dream, but in the waking reality of a silent, empty space. And the screaming, I realize, has been happening for a long time, but there is no sound. There is only the silence and the white. So much white.
For 20 years, my voice was the most valuable commodity in any room. With it, I could build empires and dismantle lives. I was a weapon forged in the crucible of corporate law, a man who understood the truth was an inconvenience and language was simply a tool for shaping reality to my will. At 42, I had it all. The penthouse overlooking a city that felt like it belonged to me, a portfolio that was the envy of men twice my age, and a reputation for a ruthlessness so profound it was almost considered an art form. I was a winner. The world was a zero-sum game, and my primary function was to ensure the other guy's score was always zero. A week before my world ended, I remember standing in a boardroom, the air thick with the smell of fear and expensive cologne. On the other side of the polished mahogany table sat Samuel Getter, my partner of 15 years, a good man who had the unfortunate flaw of possessing a conscience. He was objecting to the terms of a hostile takeover, speaking of loyalty to the employees we were about to render obsolete. I let him finish. Then I calmly, methodically used the personal secrets he had confided in me over years of supposed friendship to utterly destroy him. I painted him as unstable, an emotional liability, a man whose personal failings were a threat to the entire firm. I used his words, his fears, his deepest insecurities against him until he was silent, white-faced, and broken. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't have to. The words did the work, each one a perfectly aimed scalpel. That was power. That was winning. That evening I went home to Elise. She met me at the door, her face etched with a familiar, weary concern. She'd heard what happened to Samuel. "Paul, you can't keep doing this," she'd pleaded. "You're burning every bridge you've ever built." I remember looking at her, at this beautiful, compassionate woman who still held on to the naive belief that kindness was a currency, and I felt nothing but a profound sense of contempt. I told her the weak build bridges, the strong decide who gets to cross. She didn't say another word. The next day, her things were gone. On the nightstand, she'd left a single, tear-stained note. "I promise you will end up alone." I read it, crumpled it up, and tossed it in the trash. It was just another liability, neatly excised. The deal I closed that Friday, the one that finalized Samuel's ruin and netted me a fortune, was particularly vicious. It was a masterpiece of legal cruelty. To celebrate, I went to my favorite bar and drank the most expensive scotch they had. Alone.
The world outside the bar was a blur of neon and rain. The scotch sang in my veins, a warm, arrogant hum. This was my city, my kingdom. I got into my car, the powerful engine, a deep growl that resonated with the sense of absolute dominance I felt. The rules were for other people. The speed limits, the stop signs, the sobriety checkpoints, they were a quaint set of suggestions for the timid masses I spent my life outsmarting. My phone buzzed in the console. It was Elise. I saw her name on the screen and felt a surge of nothing. Annoyance, maybe. A loose end I had failed to tie off completely. I ignored the call. I pressed harder on the accelerator, the city lights streaking into lines of pure color through the rain-slicked windshield. I wasn't just driving, I was asserting my dominance over the road, over the lesser people in their lesser cars. A wave of pure, uncut arrogance washed over me, a feeling I recognized better than my own reflection. I was Paul Sterling. The world was mine. Then I saw the headlights. A family sedan pulling out slowly, cautiously from a side street. They had the right of way. Any sane person, any sober person would have slowed down. I did the opposite. I felt my own foot pressed down, a surge of adrenaline and contempt. Get out of my way. The thought was not born of panic, but of pride. I didn't brace for impact. I didn't swerve. In the final microsecond before the world exploded into a symphony of screeching metal and shattering glass, I had a single crystal clear moment of absolute self-awareness. I saw my life of casual cruelty, of broken promises and trampled souls, and I didn't feel regret. I felt justified. I woke to the smell of antiseptic and the muted beeping of machines. My first sensation was a searing electric pain behind my eyes. A man's voice, calm and distant, was speaking. "Mr. Sterling, you've been in an accident. You're very lucky to be alive." I tried to open my eyes to glare at him, to assert my authority, but there was only darkness, a thick, impenetrable black. There was significant trauma to your head. The impact severed both of your optic nerves. "I'm very sorry, Mr. Sterling. You're never going to see again." The doctor's words didn't register as a tragedy. They registered as an insult. Blindness was a weakness, an imperfection. I felt not grief, but a hot volcanic rage. How dare this happen to me? My penthouse became a luxurious, high-tech prison. I was still Paul Sterling, I told myself. I could run my empire from a leather chair just as easily as I could from a boardroom. I barked orders into my phone, my voice the only weapon I had left, but it was no longer enough. I couldn't read the fear in a subordinate's eyes, or the weakness in an opponent's posture. I was navigating a world of ghosts, and my rage grew with every perceived failure, every moment of frustrating helplessness. The true horror began on a Tuesday. My assistant was reading the final points of a new acquisition contract. As she spoke the word contract, the world dissolved. The sterile quiet of my apartment was replaced by the chaotic noise of a crowded coffee shop. I felt a surge of humiliation so profound it buckled my knees. I felt the hot sting of tears welling in my eyes. Through a haze of someone else's vision, I saw my own face, smiling a cold, predatory smile from across a small table. I was seeing the world through the eyes of Kylie Ramey, a brilliant young software developer whose company I had destroyed, whose life's work I had stolen with a contract full of predatory, hidden clauses. I was feeling her despair, her helpless fury, her life shattering around her. Then, just as suddenly, I was back in my apartment, gasping for air, the scent of her cheap, burnt coffee still in my nostrils. I dismissed it as a hallucination, a side effect of the trauma and the pain medication. I called my doctor, demanded new tests, convinced it was a neurological glitch that could be fixed. But a few days later, it happened again. A lawyer on the phone used the word promise, and I was no longer in my apartment. I was in my old bedroom, seeing through Elisa's tear-filled eyes as she looked at my side of the bed, the cold, empty space where I should have been. I felt the crushing weight of her loneliness, the agony of a promise I had broken without a second thought. I started to understand. It wasn't random. It wasn't medication. It was the words. The very tools I had used to build my life were now the keys to my own personal hell. Every trigger word plunged me into the consciousness of my victims, forcing me to experience the precise emotional devastation I had inflicted. This wasn't a glitch. It was a punishment, a sentence. And I, the master of language, was now its terrified, unwilling slave.
Silence became my sanctuary and my prison. I understood that language itself was the enemy. Every word spoken was a loaded gun, and I could never know which one held the bullet. I retreated into a world of texture and ambient sound. The hum of the refrigerator, the feel of cool granite beneath my fingertips, these were the only things I could trust. I canceled my phone plan. I existed in a fortress of quiet, but it was a siege and I was running out of supplies. You can't shut out the world forever. The arrogance was the last thing to die. For weeks I told myself I could beat it, but there was no logic, no pattern. It was the chaos of a guilty conscience armed with a perfect memory. Finally, broken and desperate, I did the one thing my former self would have found utterly contemptible. I admitted I needed help. I've found a new therapist, Dr. Reed. Her office was the epitome of clinical tranquility. We spent 3 sessions in relative silence, but on the 4th section, the peace was shattered. She began gently. Paul, let's start with your work. What did it mean to you? What was your goal? Goal. The word landed like a stone. The air grew cold. I was 12, in my father's study, boasting about a debate I had won through cruelty. I saw his face, the disappointment of physical weight. Is this who you want to be, Paul? A man who wins by making others lose? I felt my own childish heart harden, making a conscious choice to value winning above anything else. That was the goal. I choked. A dry, rasping sound. Can't, I whispered. Dr. Reed's voice remained impossibly calm. It's all right, Paul. Let's talk about your relationships. About loyalty. Loyalty. A dozen faces flashed behind my eyelids, a gallery of my betrayals. Samuel Getter, my partner, his face white with shock in the boardroom. Mentors whose ideas I'd stolen. Friends whose calls I'd ignored. Each face was frozen in a moment of pain and disbelief, their eyes all asking the same question. Why? The word wasn't a concept, it was a debt, and the ghosts of my creditors were here to collect. Stop, I begged, pushing myself up. This room is the most dangerous place on earth. I stumbled forward and went down,
hard, the sound of a lamp shattering. "Paul, you're not in danger here," Dr. Reed's voice said. "Closer now. Let's just talk about what happened. Let's talk about the accident." Accident. The final key. The master word. The world of scent and sound vanished. I was in my car. It was night. It was raining. I could feel the slick leather of the steering wheel, taste the expensive scotch. My phone buzzed. Elise. I ignored it. I pressed harder on the accelerator. I was Paul Sterling. I was a winner. The rules were for other people. Then the headlights. The family sedan. I felt my own foot pressed down. A surge of adrenaline and contempt. Get out of my way. In the final microsecond before the world exploded into a symphony of a screeching metal and shattering glass, I had a single crystal clear moment of absolute self-awareness. I saw my life of casual cruelty, of broken promises and trampled souls, and I didn't feel regret. I felt justified. The crash wasn't a tragedy. It wasn't an accident. It was the bill arriving at the end of a long and decadent meal that I had forced everyone else to pay for. It was the perfect, logical, and inevitable conclusion to the man I had chosen to be. I was on the floor of Dr. Reed's office, but I was also in the twisted metal, feeling the horrified crunch of bone and the searing pain of my own blinding. I screamed. It was not a scream of fear or of pain, but of raw, undiluted confession. A sound torn from the deepest, most rotten part of my soul. An admission of every sin unleashed into the quiet, sterile air of that room. I screamed until my throat was raw, until there was nothing left inside me but the hollow, echoing truth of my own monstrosity. The villain was me. It had always been me.
That was 6 months ago. The screaming has stopped. My life is quiet now. I still live in the apartment, this monument to a man who no longer exists. Dr. Reed still comes to see me, though our sessions are different. We talk. We use words, and sometimes the visions still come. When she says the word contract, I see Kylie Ramey's face. But now I don't just feel her pain, I feel my own shame. I see the hopeful young woman and the predator who destroyed her. And for the first time, I can finally see the difference between them. I don't fight the vision. I bear witness to it. When I hear the word promise, Elise's tear-streaked face appears in the darkness, and I no longer flinch away. I stay with her in that memory, and I whisper the apology I was too proud and too cruel to give her back then. The ghosts are still here. Samuel Getter, my father, all of them. They are the permanent inhabitants of my sightless world. They are not my torturers anymore. They are my jurors. My horror was never about the dark. It was about being forced to see myself with no filters, no excuses, no lies. It was about being the sole captive audience to the perfect, vivid replay of my own life, and finally understanding the story from every other character's point of view. I thought my punishment was blindness, but it wasn't. The punishment was clarity. The horror was seeing. And now, in the endless, silent dark of the courtroom I have built for myself, I have finally begun to serve my sentence. I see the things I was forced to see, and for the first time in my life, I am not looking away.
My name is Evelyn, and I'm a photographer. Not the kind that shoots weddings or smiling families in a park. I chase ghosts. Not literal ones, of course. I don't believe in that stuff. Never have. The ghosts I chase are the ones left behind in peeling paint, in the skeletal remains of a forgotten factory, or in the hollow silence of an abandoned asylum. My camera is my anchor, the one thing I can trust to show me what's real. It doesn't lie. It doesn't imagine things. It captures light and shadow, and that's it. There's a comfort in that, a solidity that I've clung to for as long as I can remember. My life is built on routines, on the predictable rhythm of my days. Every morning, I walk to the Sweet Tooth, a little cake shop on the corner of Elm and Main. I get a plain bagel with cream cheese and a black coffee. Every evening on my way home, I stop by again for a slice of whatever catches my eye. It's my little reward, a small pocket of sweetness in a world that often feels gray and uncertain. That walk, the one I've taken thousands of times, is as familiar to me as my own reflection. I know every crack in the pavement, every crooked lamppost that flickers. It's my territory, my safe space. Or at least it used to be. My parents would tell you I was an imaginative child. Too imaginative. I saw things they couldn't, things that weren't there. A man made of shadows who lived in the corner of my room, a door in the hallway that only I could see. They called them night terrors, figments of an overactive imagination. They took me to doctors who gave my feelings complicated names and prescribed little white pills that made the world feel fuzzy and distant. The other kids at school weren't so clinical. They just called me a freak. The whispers followed me down the hallways, the pointing fingers, the laughter that felt like a physical blow. I learned to keep my mouth shut, to bury the things I saw deep inside where no one could find them. The camera was my salvation. It became my way of proving to myself, and to everyone else, that I knew the difference between what was real and what wasn't. If I could capture it on film, it was real. If I couldn't, it was just a ghost in my head. It's a strange way to live, I know, constantly seeking validation from a machine, but it's the only way I've found to keep the shadows at bay. My work, exploring the forgotten corners of the world, is an extension of that. It's a way to confront the unsettling, the eerie, the places that feel like they're on the edge of reality, and to tame them with the click of a shutter. I am in control. I decide what's real. But lately, something has felt off. It's a feeling I can't quite shake, a subtle wrongness that prickles at the edges of my perception. It started on my walks home. A flicker in my peripheral vision, a shadow that seems to stretch a little too long, a corner that feels just a bit too sharp. I'd whip my camera up, snap a picture, and find nothing out of the ordinary. Just the same old street, the same old houses. I'd tell myself it was fatigue, my mind playing tricks on me after a long day of editing photos. But the feeling persisted, a low hum of anxiety that I couldn't rationalize away. I started to dread my evening walks, the way the setting sun cast long, distorted shadows that seemed to twist and writhe. It felt like something was watching me, something fast and unseen, something that didn't care about the rules of my carefully constructed reality. It was a feeling that reminded me of my childhood, of the shadow man in the corner of my room, a feeling I'd spent my entire life running from, and I had a sinking feeling, a cold knot of dread in the pit of my stomach, that this time my camera wouldn't be enough to save me. This time the monster was real. It was a Tuesday. I remember that clearly. The sky was a bruised purple, and the air was thick with the promise of rain. I had just left the Sweet Tooth, a small box with a slice of red velvet cake nestled inside clutched in my hand. The familiar weight of my camera bag was a comforting presence against my hip. As I stepped onto the street, something caught my eye. Across the way, the hanging sign for the coffee shop, The Daily Grind, was completely upside down. The lettering was perfect, just inverted, a flawless mirror image of itself. I stopped and chuckled. It was the kind of perfect mundane error I love to capture, a little slice of absurd reality. I lifted my camera, framed the shot, and pressed the shutter. The flash fired, painting the entire street in a brilliant, searing white for a split second. And then, the ground beneath me lurched. It wasn't an earthquake, not the rolling tremor I'd felt once before. This was a single, violent shake, a brutal shrug from the earth that threw me off balance. I stumbled, catching myself on a lamppost. When I looked up, blinking the ghost of the flash from my eyes, the world seemed to settle back into place. The sign was still upside down. Nothing else looked out of the ordinary. Except the street looked longer. My apartment building, which was usually just a short 2-minute walk away, seemed just a little bit more distant. The perspective felt wrong, stretched. A cold knot formed in my stomach, the same dread from my childhood, whispering that the shadows were back. I tried to rationalize it. An optical illusion, a trick of the fading light, and the after image of the flash. I was just tired. I took a deep breath and started walking. My boots clicking on the pavement, the sound unnaturally loud in the sudden, profound silence. The usual evening symphony of distant traffic, of neighborhood dogs and muffled televisions had vanished. The world had gone mute. I kept my eyes fixed on my apartment building's entrance, that familiar red door, my beacon. But it wasn't getting any closer. I walked for what felt like 5 minutes, my pace steady and determined, but the door remained stubbornly distant. In fact, it seemed to be getting further away. I stopped, my heart hammering against my ribs. New buildings, squat and featureless with dark vacant windows, now stood where familiar houses should have been. Unfamiliar alleyways, like jagged black scars, branched off the main street, each one a gaping mouth leading to utter darkness. I spun around, intending to retreat to the warmth and sanity of the cake shop, but it was gone. Or rather, it was now an impossibly tiny speck of light at the far end of a street that stretched for what looked like miles. I was trapped on an endless asphalt treadmill, a hamster in a wheel built by a madman. Panic began to set in, hot and sharp. I fumbled for my camera, my trusted anchor to reality. I snapped a picture of the street ahead, then the street behind. The screen glowed, but the images were a nightmare of glitched pixels and fractured lines. The photos showed a world that was broken, a reality tearing itself apart at the seams. My denial shattered like a pane of glass. This wasn't in my head. This was happening. A low humming sound began to permeate the silence, a subsonic vibration that I felt more in my teeth and bones than heard with my ears. It was the sound of immense, ancient machinery, the sound of reality being re-engineered. The familiar red brick of the buildings around me began to shift and flow, the mortar between them swirling like oil on water. The cracks in the pavement, the ones I knew so well, began to writhe and connect, forming intricate, impossible patterns that hurt to look at. A new sound joined the humming, a rhythmic dripping. Drip, drip, drip. It was close, seemingly right behind my left shoulder, a wet, insistent sound that made the hairs of my arms stand on end. I spun around, but there was nothing there. Just the empty, stretching street. I was being toyed with, I realized. This wasn't random chaos. It was deliberate, intelligent. It was a performance. The architect, the name surfacing in my mind like a dredged-up corpse, was putting on a show just for me. My terror gave way to a surge of desperate defiance. I couldn't keep walking this impossible street. I had to break the pattern. I saw one of the new dark alleyways to my right. It was a stupid, reckless idea, the kind of thing the final girl in a horror movie does right before she dies, but the street was a slow death, an erosion of my sanity. The alley, at least, was a choice,
a point of no return. I took a breath and plunged into the darkness. The alley was suffocatingly narrow, the brick walls so close I could touch both at the same time. They were slick with a cold, viscous fluid that smelled faintly of ozone and decay. The dripping was louder in here, echoing off the walls, surrounding me. Drip. Drip. It sounded like it was coming right from above my head from the slit of bruised purple sky visible between the rooftops. At the far end of the alley, maybe 20 meters away, was a single metal door. It was dented and rusted, but it was a feature in a world that was quickly becoming featureless. As I get closer, my heart leapt into my throat. It was the back door to my apartment building. I recognized the specific pattern of dents near the handle, the crooked number 3 painted on it. A wave of disorienting relief washed over me. Maybe this was a shortcut, a way out of the madness. I scrambled the last few meters, my hands shaking as I dug in my pocket for my keys. The brass key to the back entrance felt blessedly real, its sharp edges a comfort in my palm. It slid into the lock. It turned. The door swung inward with a low groan, and I stumbled through, desperate for the familiar, slightly musty smell of the lobby. But I wasn't in the lobby. I was in my apartment. I was standing at the end of the hallway facing my own front door from the inside. The air was thick, heavy with the smell of dust and old paper, a scent of profound neglect. The quiet was absolute. My refrigerator, a constant gentle hum in the background of my life, was silent. And the dripping sound, it was here, with me, inside. It was coming from the closed door to my bathroom. The architect had me. It had followed me home, or rather, it had turned my home into another piece of its impossible architecture. The very geometry of the space I knew best now felt alien. The angles of the walls subtly wrong, the ceiling oppressively low. My sanctuary was now the heart of the cage.
The apartment was a breathing trap. I tried the front door, but the knob was cold and smooth, used to the frame. It wouldn't turn. The window in the living room was no longer glass, but a flat gray surface that was cold to the touch. The dripping from the bathroom was the only sound, a steady, maddening beat in the crushing silence. I pushed the bathroom door open, and my stomach plummeted. It didn't open into the small tiled room I knew. It opened back into the hallway I was standing in, creating a perfect, nauseating loop. I slammed it shut, my breath coming in ragged gasps. My home was no longer a place, it was a puzzle box, and I was the prize trapped inside. The walls began to shift. The simple, calming pattern of the wallpaper seemed to crawl, the lines twisting into impossible, non-Euclidean shapes that made my head spin. A door appeared where none had been before. Hope, desperate and foolish, flared in my chest. I wrenched it open and found myself staring into the decaying hall of the abandoned asylum I'd photographed a month ago. I slammed it shut. The image of peeling paint and rusted bed frames burned into my mind. The apartment was stitching itself together with the fabric of my memories, turning my life's work into a maze. I started to run. Every door I opened was a new failure, a new dead end, twisted from my own past. One opened into the cavernous, silent space of the skeletal factory. Another opened into a perfect replica of my childhood hallway with the door that only I could see. I was trapped in a labyrinth of my own making. The familiar turned into the monstrous. The loss of recognition was the purest form of terror. It was like losing my own mind, one room at a time. After what felt like an eternity of this frantic, hopeless flight, I threw open one last door and collapsed sobbing onto a familiar floor. I was in my bedroom. It was perfect.
My bed was neatly made, my books were on the shelf, the moonlight was streaming through the window. For a heart-stopping moment, I thought it was over. Then I heard it. A low, grinding scrape, like stone on stone. It was coming from the walls. I scrambled to my feet and watched in horror as the wall opposite my bed began to inch forward. The ceiling groaned, a web of cracks spreading across its surface as it began a slow, inexorable descent. The room was shrinking. The furniture began to protest, my wooden desk groaning, a leg snapping with a sharp crack. My bookshelf tilted, sending books tumbling to the floor. The air grew thick, the pressure building with every passing second. Claustrophobia, raw and primal, seized me. This was a more intimate horror than the maze. This was a physical threat, a slow, inevitable death. I was being squeezed out of existence. I pounded on the walls, my knuckles bloodying against the shifting wallpaper, but it was like hitting solid rock. My screams were swallowed by the groaning of the dying room. I was a rat in a shrinking cage, and the horror was absolute. My carefully constructed reality, my logic, my camera, all of it was useless. I was going to be crushed by the four walls of my own sanctuary, a grim, poetic end that the architect had designed just for me. My life, my fears, and my death, all contained in a single shrinking room.
As the walls closed in, the pressure building in my ears, something inside me broke. The part of me that had built a fortress of logic, the girl who used a camera to cage the world in neat, understandable rectangles, shattered. All that was left was the child who saw impossible things, the one who was called a freak. My entire life, I had run from that part of myself. Now it was my only hope. The architect had built this prison from my logic, so logic couldn't be the key. I had to do something irrational, something insane. My eyes darted to the window. Outside wasn't the familiar street, but a swirling, starless void. It wasn't an escape, it was an execution. And it was the only choice I had left, to be crushed or to jump into nothing. I surrendered to the madness. With a final, desperate scream, I launched myself at the window. The glass didn't shatter, it dissolved around me like smoke. And then I was falling, but not falling. There was no rush of air, no plummeting sensation. I was floating, suspended in a cool, silent, liquid black space. It was the absolute opposite of the crushing pressure of the room. It was vast, empty, and strangely peaceful. The sensory deprivation was total. There was no up, no down, no sound, no light. There was only me and the slow, gentle drift into oblivion. My terror faded, replaced by an exhausted emptiness. My consciousness frayed at the edges, and I let go, passing out into the silent, black void. I woke with a gasp, the smell of sugar and roasting coffee beans filling my lungs. I was sitting on the pavement, my back against the cool brick wall of the Sweet Tooth. The small white box with its slice of red velvet cake was resting beside me. The night was quiet, but it was a normal quiet, filled with the distant hum of the living city. My heart hammered against my ribs. I scrambled to my feet and looked across the street. The sign for the daily grind was right side up. I looked down the block. My apartment building was exactly where it should be, a comfortable, boring distance away. It was over. I had escaped. But as I stood there under the warm, normal glow of the streetlights, a chilling certainty settled into my bones. I hadn't reclaimed my reality. I had only survived a nightmare. The memory of the walls closing in, the feeling of that liquid black space had carved something new into my soul. The walk was over for now.
but I would never be home again. My camera hanging at my side felt like a child's toy, a useless trinket against the darkness I now knew existed. Because the architect was real, and I understood now that its labyrinth wasn't a place it put you in. It was a place that was always there, just beneath the surface of the world you thought you knew. And that, I realized, is the most terrifying thing of all.
Thank you so much for watching or listening. Like and subscribe for more nightmares. Your support keeps the darkness from consuming this channel, so we can face the next terrifying story together. Don't be left in the dark.